right? Okay. All right. And when I'm presenting, I'm not going to be able to watch the chat. I just know I just know myself. So I hope that maybe Bruce, you could help me out and keep an eye on the chat, and if there's anything that you can bring it up.
Yeah, Lynn,
But
we'll be keeping an eye on the chat,
great.
and then during the Q&A we can refer back to it. So
Right.
no
Great.
worries there.
Thanks. So, the title of this is The Effect of Mother and Child Separation and Reunion Outcomes. And I have this picture. Anybody know the humor behind this picture? Put it in the chat if anybody knows the humor behind this picture. And if nobody knows, yeah, well, okay, yep, right. So mother and child reunion, this could be a heavy topic, so I figured I would start out with a little humor. I had originally you wanted to use this picture, right? I just loved this picture. I love the composition of it, but I decided that I didn't want to use it because all too often adoptees are looked at as a perpetual child, and I didn't want to I didn't want to use it for that reason. So I decided to go with this one. But anyway, um, I'd like to. We're gonna have a poll about kind of like who's here, right? What's your role? Are you? So do we have that poll ready? Just so we know who the audience is. All right. So if you could do me a favor, take a look and see who we have here. So I'm going to give you 2 more seconds and then I'll end the poll. Okay. So I'll share the results. So interesting, this is pretty much what the sample looks like also. A larger number of adoptees than first parents. And then we have some adoptive parents, and we have a sibling, which is great, and some mental health professionals. And so I'm gonna stop sharing right now the poll. Um, but for the sibling, I applaud you. All right, I applaud you because this is such a complicated dynamic, right? And everybody needs to understand it. So I appreciate you being here, and I'm sure your sibling does also. But anyway, so anybody get this graphic? Right? The genesis of this project. Where did this project come from? As I'm not sure. I'm trying to think. I don't think in my introduction, Bruce, um, that it was acknowledged that I am a first mother, right? So I am a first mother who's in reunion with my daughter, right? It's been about 7 years now. If anybody's interested, I would, I was interviewed on by Damon Davis and Heidi Marble. So you could find my story if you want to. Heidi's was kind of my first voice, and I went incognito. So I went by Lynn Z. You get it, Lynn Z, right? So that was my code name, Lynn Z. So if you look for me, and you can find my story. But anyway, so I'm in reunion with my daughter for for 7 years now, and when she first called me, I was couldn't believe it, right? I couldn't believe it. And so I read everything I could get my hand on. And it said stuff like, go slow and you'll need space and all that kind of stuff. But, I didn't believe it, right? I didn't believe it. I wasn't going to go slow and I wasn't going to need space. My daughter said, she wanted to go faster than me and she didn't want space. Well, uh, when your feet hit the ground, some people need space, right? And so when I felt a little distance between my daughter and I I started to wonder, right? I started to wonder, and I started to kind of rely on my background, right? I'm a college professor. I do research. I said I'm going to see what the research says about adoption reunions, and it's probably not a surprise to anybody here. When I went to see what the research was, there was I don't want to say that there was no research, but the amount of research that was there was very minimum, right? There was not much research at all. Um, but I had some questions, right? I had some questions. I wanted to know certain things, and so I decided I was just going to ask the question. Right? I was just going to ask the questions, and so I created this survey, right? And as I had mentioned that or in the intro, originally I was just interested. I'm going to be sarcastic for those. Some of you know me, and you're not surprised, right? But originally, I just wanted my answers, right? I just wanted my questions answered, right? I just wanted my questions answered, and so I put together this survey with my questions, right? I wanted to know certain things, and but but as I as adult Lynn, right, took over, right, little Lynn was just concerned about herself, but when adult Lynn took over, uh, the survey ended up growing, right? And we'll talk about how we're expanded in a little bit, but the causes of it. But it expanded to be more than just adoption reunion, right? It looked into questions that cut across kind of adoption as a whole. You didn't have to be in reunion to answer some of these questions, right? It also asked questions about interracial and international adoption experiences. But the most important, I think, was the the addition to the addition of the mental health questions, right? And I have to at the end I will I formally thank Damon Davis for this. um, he really kind of pushed that, and then also Astrid Castro find it or fine tuned it a little bit, and she also was the one who kind of pushed me with the interracial and international adoptions. And so for those of you who took the survey, that's where the questions come from. But anyway, so just the timeline of the survey, and it's kind of amazing how quickly this went out. And I'm going to say it went this quick because the topic is so important, right? That I was in a meeting the other day, and I said that I finally realized that I didn't have to be quiet, right? I finally realized that I didn't have to be quiet. I could say stuff. I could use my voice. And I think a lot of I'm just going to say I'm going to use the word we collectively, right? I think we realize that we can tell our story. Other people don't have to tell our story, and that numbers matter, right? Again, I was talking with some people, and somebody reminded me that I said that stories change hearts, but numbers change policy, right? So we needed to have some real hard data to talk about what's going on, right? What are the long-term issues of adoption? So, I came up with this first set of questions in October, or the idea, right? I shared my questions out. People gave me feedback. Bruce was one of the people who provided me some feedback. I created the draft, and then I sent it out for it to be vetted. And up until up until 7 years ago, my walls were up like you wouldn't believe, right? And so I wasn't really in tune with the adoption community because I thought that I was the only one who was suffering, and so it was all. But so when I went to vet the survey, it's not like I had a bunch of friends to go out and vet it with. I did. Again, I did have some that I tapped their shoulders on, and then I went out and I just sent out emails to people, kind of cold calling them to say, would you look at my survey? And I got two yeses back, right? Damon Davis and Ostrid Castro, and they their input, I think, really made the survey better, right? With Damon, he was the first one to look at it, and I sent it to him, and he said something along the line of, "This seems a little mother focused," and I'm like, "Yeah, because I'm a mother and I'm looking for answers, right?" And he said, "Well, what about this and this and this?" And I said, "Well, we'll do that in the second survey." And he said, "You're only going to get one bite at this apple, right? You're only going to want to get one bite. You need to make it as big as possible." And then I had a question on there about looking at the age expectancies of first mothers, right? There was, anecdotally, I see a lot of first mothers die rather young, right? And I wanted to know what was that just a fluke, or is that true? Again, Damon said, I'm going to be sarcastic and paraphrasing him for humor's effect. He's going to say, like, who cares? I was like, I care, right? I want to know. But out of that conversation came out of not just how young, what age do they, but what caused their death. Again, it's a major finding, if you ask me, a major finding. He was like, well, what caused the death, right? And that's where the genesis of that mental health issue came into fact. I cleaned up the question for first mothers about, so what I did was I was asking adoptees if their first mother was alive or if they had deceased. And if they were deceased, I asked at what age, about, I gave them a 5-year time frame, and then what was the cause. Okay. But then I also took that kind of mental health kind of issue, and I asked both adoptees and first moms and fathers, have you had any unhealthy behaviors? Did you develop any unhealthy behaviors to cope with your pain, right? And when I showed the survey to Ostrid, and if I know I'm not pronouncing her name right, and I'm very sorry, and I've been practicing, I'm trying. And when I showed it to her, I had self-harm, right? I had self-harm as one of the choices. And she said, well, what about attempted suicide? And I said, well, I got first harm. I have self-harm. And she said, but that's different. I said, yeah. And it is, self-harm is very different than attempted suicide. And again, that was a critical change in the study, in the survey. But anyway, so the survey went live in February, in the middle of February. The survey went live, and then I collected what I'm referring to as phase 1 data, right? I collected it phase 1 because the link is still live, and people still are. I looked day before yesterday, and people are still answering the survey, and it's good. I want them to continue to answering because next year, July 1st, 2025, I'm going to pull phase 2 data to see whether or not there are any changes in the data, right? Anytime you have a survey, it's always affected by who answers it, right? But so the more people we can get to answer it, the bigger the audience, the stronger the results will be. But anyway, so I pulled it July 1st, and since July 1st till now, I've been looking at the data. When I first started to do this, I was hoping to get 300. I would be ecstatic if I had gotten 500 people to answer. I had over 1,300. So it's going through all this data. It's a slow process. So if anybody is interested in helping, I'm looking for it. And so there's a lot of data, and it's unfunded, right? This is not a funded search study. I did this because I have a personal interest into it, right? So I have a day job, right? So this is after my day job. I know it said I just retired. I did just retire because I had my time in it was in Thelm State, and I'm working someplace else now. But so this is all done, anyway, that doesn't matter. But anyway, so what did we get, right? So how did I get the survey out, right? I created a Facebook page, and since February, I have over 400 followers for this Facebook page. I don't have 400 followers on my own Facebook page, and I've had it for 10 years. But this I've had for 4 months, and I have over 400, right? So I created the page, and then I used Facebook marketing to originally get the survey out, though it wasn't giving anything. Right? I was getting no results, and maybe it's because I just don't know what I'm doing. But the way that they were billing and charging, it just wasn't worth it. I didn't get anybody. But so I then decided to take specific outreach to various adoption related organizations, right? And again, I'm calling them, saying, or emailing them, saying, would you support? And I got some support from lots of different places. I do want to highlight NAP, the National Association of Adoptees and Parents. They were extremely supportive, and thank you, Beth, if you're here. They were extremely supportive and helped get the word out. But I made a conscious effort to post things on that Facebook page, updates, what I was doing, and people shared those. And you tell 2 friends, and they tell 2 friends, and they tell 2 friends. And so it was amazing, the reception that this got in the community. So thank you for all of you who participated in whatever way you did, from taking the survey to telling somebody about it, to posting it, to even liking it, right? But anyway, it netted over 1,300 individuals. So it was amazing that I found a picture that said 13 plus for summer 24, but it was perfect. But so we had 1,300. All right. Now, I did take a look at those responses, and some of them were deleted, right? So originally I was, I want to say I was at like 1360 or something like that. And people didn't have to complete the survey all at once. But so if you didn't come back to answer it, and you answered less than 20% of the survey, you were deleted. There were some duplicates. I work at a university, right? And I know that my students would call me. I got kicked off. They were taking a test, and they'd get kicked off, or they would do this, or they need to get back on. And so, I just figured I would set up the survey where you could get back on. If you got kicked off, you'd be able to get back on. But because of that, it was in open access, and at times there were a handful of people who took it more than once. And the program that I use kind of identifies who duplicates are. And if you were a duplicate, I looked at your I looked there, right? And if you were a duplicate because you were both a first parent and an adoptee, you weren't deleted. But if you were an adoptee who just took the survey twice, or a first mother who just took the survey twice, I looked at the survey answers, and the one that was most complete was the one that I kept. And it was the second one, right? They answered the comment questions, right? Then I also, and when I say deleted, I still have the data, right? I still have the data, but for this 1313 number, I also am not including responses from mothers who said the adoption was caused by a termination of rights. And I did that because I wanted the data to be as clean as possible, right? Especially because we started to look at mental health issues. And let me say that my own mother had her terminations of parental rights removed, right? Well, anyway, so I was just trying to say it in a way that was kind of, but my mother lost the custody of her children, right? And I know that when you're in that kind of situation, there are other things going on, and I didn't want to dirty the population, right? I didn't want anybody to question the results. Somebody could say, well, those mental health issues, they were there beforehand, right? They were there before the woman lost her termination of parental rights. So I took those out. I also removed one first mother whose adoption was just less than a year old, right? If we're looking at long-term issues, a year old wouldn't help the data, right? And there was also an adoptee who was raised by her first mother, but was adopted by her stepfather, right? Again, I didn't include her results in the calculations. So that's kind of like not a finalized answer. And so I have that over on the side. But anyway, so I kind of cleaned up the data on who was there. Then I also looked at the other, right? So I often gave a question, and for instance, I asked, what racial group are you, right? And I had a list. And there were some people who put other, and then listed what their other was. And if their other was actually already included, like there was one person, all right, who said that they were like Irish and Italian, right? Well, they're Caucasian, right? So I put Caucasian, right? And there was somebody from a Russian country, and again that they were Caucasian, and somebody was I forget if it was white and Hispanic or Hispanic and African American. I'm not exactly sure, but so they were they there was a category that said mixed race, and so we moved them into the mixed race category. But we did have a handful of those that were others, and those others are um, kind of indigenous, right? I had a fair share of people from New Zealand, and so but anyway, so that was a different category that I didn't put in. I also looked at how do you feel around your birthday. I had categories, and one of my categories was sad. And when they wrote in the other, they said they were depressed, right? So I moved that into the sad, right? Another change was how you refer to your mother. Um, I had the category was one of the categories was mom or something similar. And there was somebody who said, I call her the Korean term for mother. Right. Well, that was mom in another term kind of deal. So, right. And then the cause of death. And here I had help of an RN, right? The way I set this question up, it was my fault. People could check more than one, right? They could check more than one cause. But I wanted to distill it down to kind of one cause. So with the help of an RN, we went through all of those multiple listings, and we picked the one that was more than likely the major cause. For example, there was some that clicked, unhealthy unhealthy behaviors and health related, right? But the mother died at 82, right? Well, if the mother died at 82, it was health related. It really wasn't, unhealthy lifestyle because she lived until she was 82. But if that same person had died when she was 35, then it was counted as a unhealthy lifestyle. Does that make sense? I hope that clears how I cleaned up the data. Okay. Now, with that being said, the data population, right? It was mostly adoptees, right? It was mostly female, and it was mostly closed adoption, right? We did have, we had 7 first fathers answering the survey, which I thought was great. We had, I think that there were 3 NPEs, and so that's right. Now, when it comes to racially, participants were mostly white. You can see what the breakdown is, and mostly from the United States. Though I want to point out that except for Antarctica, we have one person, at least one person from every continent in the world, right? With the one person from South America, it puts me over the top, right? So every continent in the world, except Antarctica, which nobody lives in, right? Answered the survey. All right. Now, kind of to who made contact, right? So the majority of people who answered the survey had contact with their other, right? And when I say other, I'm referring to mother child, right? I'm not the first one to use that phrase other to refer to as mother child. And if I was a better person, I could give you the reference for the first time I saw it. But I'm looking, at that kind of the adoptee's other is their first mother. The first mother's other is the adopted, right? So for this survey, the majority of people actually were the people who made contact, right? So So 72% of adoptees and 85% of first mothers, right? This is actually one of the questions that I had to begin with, right? Um, I was hearing from adoptees who who talk about, and I'm not going to use the term because I don't agree with it, because I never rejected my daughter in the first place, right? And they would talk about, you know, their first mother not wanting to meet with them, right? And there's a term out there. I'm sure some of you know what it is, but I'm not going to use the term because again, I never rejected my daughter the first time, so there was never a second time, right? But anyway, um, I would hear that from you know, from adoptees, kind of, but I would also be in mother groups, and they would talk about how, you know, their child won't talk to them. I was like, well, who's right? Who's not? And really, what it comes down to is who's not able to face their fear, right? Who's not able to face their pain, right? That's why people aren't being connected, is because they can't face their own pain, right? But anyway, so we have about 5.5% of adoptees who have reached out to their first mothers, and their first mothers won't respond, right? Or won't have contact with them, which is a little bit different than not responding, right? But so we have about, let's say, 8% of adoptees who think they know who their first mother is, but they can't connect. And we got about 6% of mothers in that same category, right? And then who was the seeker, and who was found, right? Again, for this study, the majority of the people were the seekers, right? Adoptees, 80, 86, I'm sorry, nearly 87%, 89, right? 89% of adoptees were the seeker. And it was a 50-50 split for first mothers. Again, I'll talk from my own experience, right? I didn't think I was allowed to, right? You know, and I know that I've heard adoptees have that same kind of feeling. Oh, I'm not supposed to search. Well, you know, uh, people search, right? People search, and I think that's important to understand. So now we get an idea of who the population of the survey is, um, um, how they contact one another. Again, it's kind of a mixed bag. Um, One of the things I will need to do, when I analyze further down, is to see if one group, you know, uses one method more than the other. For instance, do first mothers in closed adoptions more likely reach out via email? You know, I'm sorry. What it was? I'm sorry. I skipped one slide ahead, right? So this was how was the contact made possible, right? We know that DNA matching is more and more common. My daughter found me through a DNA match. But there are some people, especially in open adoptions and in Canada, if anybody here is from Canada, you can correct me if I'm wrong. They have a governmental agency that hands out information, I think. And so the whole push for open records. And so there are lots of ways people are getting information about their other. And then this is the, you know, how is first contact made? It's a hodgepodge, right? You could say that adoptees are more likely to call, and to write a letter, and mothers are more likely to email and use social media, right? Um, but it's a crapshoot right here. You know, I would like to, you know, do some analysis. Maybe there's one group that uses one method more than others, but that's what it is. Okay. But so now to the study's conclusions, right? So I feel like I need drum roll, right? Drum roll. Surprise, surprise. There is a long-term negative effect on individuals who are separated from their others. I stand by that, right? And my data stands by that. And how did I come to that conclusion? Well, the long-term effect, I asked adoptees, do you feel pain because of your separation from your first family? And I asked mothers, did you create unhealthy behaviors? 92, 93% of adoptees say they feel pain because of their adoption, right? 85, 86% of first mothers say they developed unhealthy behaviors because of their separation, right? This question comes directly from Bruce, right? This where do he had a different he had different choices, right? He wanted a different choice in there, but adoptees 55, 56% don't know where they belong. They don't feel as if they belong in their adoptive families or their maternal or their paternal families, right? That's long-term damage when you don't feel like you belong, right? Long-term for first mothers, right? The national life expectancy for a woman is 80 years old. It's 80.6 or something like that, which means 50% of women die before 80 and 50% of women die after 80, right? I asked adoptees, is your mother alive or is she deceased, right? If the adoptee said that their mother was deceased, I said, how old was she when she died, right? The median, right, which is that 50%, is between 65 and 70 years old, right? Which means that that first mothers lose about 10 to 15 years of their life, right? They die earlier, right? They die earlier than women who didn't lose their child to adoption, right? I'm preaching to the choir, right? When I say the body keeps a score, right? I'm sure most of the people on the call have either heard of or read, right? When the body says no, or the body keeps a score, right? The trauma stays with us, right? And for first mothers, they can lose 15 years of their life, right? Now, I do have this statement up here that talks about these data points have not been finalized, right? Again, it was the data was just pulled 6 weeks ago, right? It was just pulled 6 weeks ago. It won't be finalized until it's published, right? Until it's published, it's it won't be. But these are the numbers, right? These are the numbers. I feel like I have to professionally, I have to put a caveat out there to say that it's not published yet, right? This data is not published yet. So who knows? I could be going through and I could read one of the responses and kind of do a chain on that person's complete results and it for some reason or other, they need to be removed from the data, right? So until it's published, the data isn't finalized, but these are the numbers, right? So it might not be 38.7, maybe it might be 38.2 kind of change. I mean, we're not talking about, right? But anyway, so here's some of the questions, right? we all try to escape things. I'm not going to, the difference here, you know, it's not significant, right? And I say that I haven't done statistical analysis on it, but when I'm looking at it, the difference, everybody's trying to escape something, right? And we're all overeaters. But interestingly enough, that adoptees and first mothers restrict their eating much more than the general population. And I'm going to say that that difference is a significant difference. Again, I haven't done statistical analysis, but 5% versus 17%, I think that's a pretty significant difference, right? We're more likely to have unhealthy relationships, right? We identify as having unhealthy relationships, and we avoid, right? We avoid things. Again, 62% of adoptees say that they developed avoidance techniques, right? 55% of first mothers versus 12% in the general population. Now, I didn't find statistics for the general population on this idea about being emotionally distant, but I thought that that was a question to ask, right? 61% of adoptees feel as if they are emotionally distant. 55% of first mothers, right? A third, plus or minus, of us feel we can't stop, right? I know I was in that situation, right? I couldn't stop, right? Because when I stopped, my mind was I couldn't let my mind stop, because if my mind stopped, I was in a place where I didn't want to be. And 50% of adoptees say they have a significant need for control, right? That they need to control, and first mothers are at almost a 40%. Again, I don't have the general population numbers to compare that to, but that's significant if you ask me. All right, now this is the big slide, right? This is the big slide. We isolate ourselves, right? It's going to be important in a second, right? We isolate ourselves. 46% versus 20% the general population. Interesting, there's no difference in drug abuse, but there's a big difference in alcohol abuse. And I was speaking with some people, and I was talking to some adoptees in particular, and I talked about this statistic and threw out the fact that, I can be a good adoptee and drink, but I can't be a good adoptee and do drugs. Again, that's a hypothesis of why there is a higher use of drug abuse than there is a higher level of alcohol abuse than there is drug abuse, right? It's socially accepted to drink alcohol, right? So I can still be in that realm of being a good person, drinking as opposed to alcohol, right? Hypersexuality, right? 25%, right? A quarter of both adoptees and first moms identify themselves as being hypersexual, versus 6%. Again, I think that is a statistic that will be a statistical difference that's out there. And then we get to this idea about physical harm and attempted suicide, right? So 17% of adoptees reported that they self-harm. We'll round it to 12% of first mothers have self-harm versus 6% in the national population. But really, what makes this study so important is this idea of attempted suicide, right? Nationally, 0.06% of people attempt suicide. So that's 6 out of 10,000, right? Adoptees report 21.5% of adoptees report that they've attempted suicide, and nearly 24% of first mothers have reported attempting suicide. We know that the common wisdom states that adoptees are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than non-adopted people. When I was getting these numbers, I was like, this can't be right. This absolutely can't be right. So I looked at the original study where this came from. And this original study came from someplace in the Midwest, and they looked at about 600 adoptees and non-adopted people, right? And they looked at adoptees between the ages of 12 and 21. And they asked the adoptive parents, has your child attempted suicide? That's how they got the statistic. If the child was above 18, then they asked the adoptee himself. But most of that data comes from asking parents, did your child attempt suicide? And it is only through the ages of 12 to 21. It's not a lifetime issue, right? Do parents know what their children are doing, right? Did their parents know whether or not that there was an attempted suicide? We know that there are lots of ways to attempt suicide that can go anyway. That's you decide that for yourself. But I'm going to say that not all adoptive parents are going to know what their child is doing, and they may not be willing to say it, right? They may not be willing to admit that their child is having trouble, but that's beside the point. I found no data on the suicide rate for first mothers or attempted suicide, and that's because it's not collected. There is some, like when I say some, like 2 studies that looked at women who lost their children because of termination of rights, but nothing on first mothers as a whole, and that's because up until 7 years ago, if something had happened to me, who would have known I was a first mother, right? I didn't tell anybody. So there's no of these records. So looking at my data, right? Oh, I'm sorry. And so the national statistic, right? The national statistic on attempted suicide, there's a range, and it depends on what agency you're looking at. The CDC, from what I found, said that about 0.5, let's round up, 0.5% of people attempt suicide over their lifetime, and about 0.6 if you go by the American Foundation of Preventing Suicide. And also going by the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, roughly about 1 in 7 out of 100,000 women die of suicide. Okay, so the CDC, right, the American Foundation, we got 0.6% attempt suicide. 0.007% of women actually die of suicide. So if we use those numbers, right, we go back to 21.5% of adoptees reported that they've attempted suicide, and 23.8% of first mothers attempted suicide. Then using that 0.06 rate, adoptees are 36 times more likely to attempt suicide, right? So you take the national average, 0.6, and you times it by 36, right? That's where you get that times 36, right? So adoptees are roughly 36 times more likely, not 4 times, 36. And first mothers are 39 times more likely to attempt suicide. Moreover, there were 545 responses from, so 245 adoptees said their mothers had died, right? And out of those, 9 of them, when I asked what was the cause of their death, 9 said they died by suicide. That gives a death rate of 3.6, right? Percent of first mothers die of suicide, which makes them 511 times more likely to die by suicide, right? 511 times more likely to die by suicide than women who haven't. I think that is, for those of you, I saw that some of you were identified as being mental health professionals. I can't imagine a bigger risk, right? Adoptees are 36 times more likely to attempt suicide, and first mothers are 511 times more likely to die by suicide. I can't imagine a bigger risk. So when I go back to the conclusion of the study being there is long-term negative effects of the separation of mother and child. All right, but let's end on a happy note, right? Let's end on a happy note. All right. So, right, Paul Simon, we go back to the mother and child reunion, right? I asked a question on, excuse me, on how would you describe, right? How would you describe your reunion? What kind of phrase? Smooth sailing, there's a few bumps in the road, it's a roller coaster, train wreck, and other, right? And only about 40% said, it's going pretty good, right? Smooth sailing or a few bumps in the road. The other ranges from all over the place, right? There are some that they're kind of all over the place, but only 40% of people say that that their contact with their other is easy, right? But do we get the play on this guy, right? We know who this guy is, right? The question was, are you glad you've had contact, right? Now 40%, so 60%. Let me just put it this way: 60% say, "Man, it's a roller coaster or a train wreck. It's terrible, terrible, terrible." But only 6% are not glad that they've made contact with their other. For those of you who are in, there's nothing like knowing, and those who are not, there's nothing like not knowing, right? And knowing, no matter what kind of emotions you go through, knowing seems to be better than not knowing. So even though it's difficult, people in connection, in reunion, are glad that they have that, right? But kind of to end with, Brene Brown. When I was younger, I wanted to be Meryl Streep with a touch of Bonnie Raitt, right? Now I want to be Brene Brown with a touch of Hurricane Ruth. And if you don't know who Hurricane Ruth is, she's worth a listen to. All right. But Brene Brown's quote is, "Owning our own story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it." Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light. And and that just rings true to me, right? You know, I you know, I've been through some dark times, right? I went through some dark times, and you know, I put on a lot of weight in the last few years, right? It was hard. It's dark. I'm gonna, you know, I wasn't emotional when I was presenting the data because that was data, but now I'm about to get emotional because it was hard, right? It's really hard. Um, I mean, and you, I'm not, I know I'm preaching to the choir. Um, but when you face that, you're stronger, right? You know, I was before reunion, I was accomplished, right? You know, I was, you know, I was successful, quote unquote. I was successful, but I was quiet. I was quiet. I didn't have you know, I didn't have my own real voice, right? I was quiet. Um, but going through the darkness, right, has helped me find my voice. And so in closing, you know, and I feel like I need to do this. I've If you look at my Vita, you know, I give 4 or 5 presentations a year, right? Never, never in any of those times have I ever given a thank you to people. But I think I owe people a thank you for this because if it wasn't for a few people, I wouldn't be here, right? I wouldn't have gotten through my darkness, right? And the first group are some people, some wonderful people, and I don't want to mention names because you know, I'm not going to say them all, and I don't want to. I don't want to leave anybody out. But um, if any of you have read anything from Joe Scholl and know that he calls them healing weekends, about one every other month, where adoptees and first mothers spend a few days together. I would not be here if it was not for those people. They have given me strength and courage to let my voice be heard. So I want to thank them publicly. And again, I don't want to mention anybody's names because I don't want to miss anybody. And you are all very important to me. And I wouldn't want to. Anyway. And then of course Joe himself, he helped me both as a therapist and as professional. He helped me with the survey. And Leslie, who is his sidekick, though not really his sidekick, much more than that. She too went through the survey. And then I had mentioned Heidi and Damon and Ashford earlier. They really I would say that Heidi helped me find my voice, my adoption voice. And the survey would not be where it is if it wasn't for Damon and Astrid's input. So thank you to them. And I know they're not here, but I still want to, you know, I want to publicly thank them. So that being said, oh yes, of course, I forgot my family, right? I forgot my family because you know we're not in this alone, and all of the ups and downs that I've had in reunion, I've often taken it out on my husband. So I want to, you know, I need to thank him also. But anyway, that being said, I know I don't have any idea how long you were expecting me to talk, but but I'm going to stop to share and we can ask some questions now if we want to.